Um, all right, so before Jean-Daniel starts with the actual talk, let me welcome you again to this seminar. My colleague Gareth is trying to join. Hopefully, he will also join us. But just to say, as I'm sure you read in the blurb of the talk, we are very happy to have Professor Jean-Daniel Collomb with us today. He works as a professor in American Studies at the Université Grenoble-Alpes. I hope I pronounced that correctly. And he's an expert who has written extensively on the topic today, which is basically the opposition between American right and the US environmental movement since the early 80s to this present. So given that we lost a bit of time at the beginning, I'm just going to go straight with you, Jean-Daniel. So you have about 45 minutes, and then we'll take it from there.
Great.
Go ahead.
Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity. I'm sorry I'm not in London to give this talk. I would have liked to cross the channel. It was too difficult, but thank you for giving me this opportunity. So, as you said, I'm here to talk about dominant Republican and conservative and libertarian positions regarding the issue of climate change and also what to do about climate change today. So I'll talk about mostly about the Republican Party in the United States, but also about conservative activists and libertarian activists today. I'm moving on to my second slide. Can you see it? Is this working for you? Is that okay? All right. So I think that what is most striking about the American right and climate change, the issue of human-made climate change and climate action, is that over the last 3 decades, the American right has proved to be a formidable obstacle to climate action. In many respects, it has been a very effective social movement, right? Insofar as its goal was to prevent ambitious climate action from happening. Now, I'll talk a couple of times about the Inflation Reduction Act that was passed by the Democrats during the summer, but it's really more an exception. It's a very important exception. We can talk about it during question times. But I mean, I'm just going to give you some example, right? So for example, the Republican Party and the American right are the main reason why there is no carbon tax at the federal level in the United States, even though many economists, not all economists, but many economists have argued for a long time that pricing carbon and using tools like a carbon tax would be extremely useful in moving the ball forward on climate. So there are regions in the United States where carbon is being priced, but there is no carbon tax at the national level. Another example would be the moment when Republicans successfully defeated Barack Obama's cap and trade bill in 2009, which had been passed by the House of Representatives, but died a quick and silent death in the American Senate in 2009. So they were instrumental in blocking this piece of legislation from being passed. After Obama and the Democrats lost control of Congress 2 years into his presidency, Obama decided to quote him, to use his pen and his phone, to use the regulatory powers of the presidency in order to try and bring about decarbonization, and he was systematically opposed by Republicans, often suing the administration to prevent the administration from imposing new regulations. Other emblematic examples are George W. Bush's decision to turn his back on the Kyoto Protocol at the very beginning of his first term in office. And of course, everyone has heard about this, Donald J. Trump's decision to withdraw from the Paris Accord in 2017. So the US actually left the Paris Accord only for a few months. It's a technical issue, but the US so far is the only country that has ever exited from the Paris Accord. And one last example, as I said, last summer, the Democrats were able to pass the largest piece of climate legislation in history, not just in American history, but in history, the so-called Inflation Reduction Act. And they did so, interestingly, without a single Republican vote, either in the House of Representatives or in the Senate. Now, I'd be remiss if I didn't say a few words about exceptions. So I think it's fair to say that the American right is not a completely monolithic group when it comes to climate. So I'm just going to give you a couple of examples, but there are really exceptions. So I think the example of John McCain springs to mind. So John McCain was the Republican senator for the state of Arizona, and he tried 3 times in the 2000s to shepherd a cap-and-trade bill through Congress. He was unsuccessful in his efforts. There's also an informal gathering in Congress called the Climate Solutions Caucus. So it's a bipartisan effort to provide a forum in which Democrats and Republicans can discuss the issue of climate change. You know, there's nothing binding about it. It's not a very large group because the rule is that if you want to join the Climate Solutions Caucus, you have to find a member of the other party to accompany you on the way. So there would be many more Democrats if only they could find more Republicans. So the number varies, but usually there are just a few dozen members of Congress in this Climate Solutions Caucus. Usually, you know, the proposals that they make are very limited and would probably fall well short of addressing the problem. Just a quick word also about the world of free market think tanks, which are so powerful on the American right, which supply Republican lawmakers with arguments, with policy proposals about a whole range of issues, including energy issues and climate change. And so most of those free market think tanks have opposed climate action for more than 3 decades. But there are some exceptions. So I'm going to give you the 2 exceptions that I know here. 2 self-described free market think tanks, which were formed just about a decade ago, the Niskanen Center and R Street, which emphasized the need to come up with free market solutions to climate change. So there are really, so for example, they've come out in support of a carbon tax, but they are really the exception rather than the rule. Another example is the Climate Leadership Council, staffed with high-ranking and high-profile Republican figures like James Baker, Henry Paulson. They published a report making the case for a carbon tax that would align with. So someone is waiting in the waiting room. I don't know if you can see it, but maybe yeah, okay. So they made a case for a carbon tax that would not violate free market principles. Now, interestingly, they published their paper in early 2017, and then fast forward a few months, Donald J. Trump announced that the U.S. would actually withdraw from the Paris Accord. So that gives you an idea of how marginal and how uninfluential those forces have been so far, right? So I'm not going to, I mean, we can go back to those figures during question time, of course, if you so wish, but I'm going to focus on the main story here, which is the influence, the very real influence of what is usually referred to as climate skepticism on the right of the American spectrum. And so, when I'm just going to review the main players here. So, of course, free market conservative think tanks and foundations, which I've already talked about. So I'm thinking of the Heritage Foundation, the Cato Institute, the American Enterprise Institute. There are many of those institutions in DC. Most of them, in one way or another, have lobbied against ambitious climate action for several decades now. There are also right-wing media figures. The late Rush Limbaugh would talk about climate change and go after Al Gore. For example, I'll talk about Al Gore again later in my presentation on numerous occasions. And of course, the foot soldiers of American climate skepticism, Republican public officials. Now, I want to ask a very simple question today. Why has climate skepticism been so ubiquitous and influential a force in right-wing circles in the US since the early 1990s, when climate change actually became a political bone of contention in the United States. Why does there seem to be no significant political cost attached to opposing vigorous climate action on the right of the political spectrum in the United States? Now, I mean, that's a simple question, but of course the answer is not an easy answer, and there are several reasons why that is. And so I'm sure that for most of you, the explanation that springs to mind is the influence, the political influence of big corporations, especially corporations in the fossil fuel sectors. And, that would be correct. I mean, that is certainly one of the main reasons why this climate skeptic movement has been so influential and so strong and so resilient for so long, right? I mean, you might have heard about the book by Naomi Oreskes and Eric Conway, Merchants of Doubt, which is not just about climate change, but devotes a long chapter to the issue of climate change. And, so it's pretty straightforward. There's actually a documentary film as well. I haven't seen it, The Merchants of Doubt. So that is one reason. Another reason, of course, is growing skepticism toward binding multilateral agreements, not just environmental agreements or climate agreements, but just binding multilateral agreements, just multilateralism in Republican circles going back to the 1980s. That wasn't really the case in the early 1970s, but from the Reagan era onwards, Republican officials and conservative scholars and activists gradually became more and more hostile toward committing the United States to ambitious multilateral agreements. And so, climate change is one area in which such an ambitious agreement would be necessary. I don't think any such ambitious agreement exists right now. I'm not a huge fan of the Paris Agreement personally, because I don't think it's very effective, but, we can talk about that as well. So here you have a quote from Donald J. Trump when he announced that the US would withdraw from the Paris Accord in June 2017. But that is not what I want to be talking about today. So I'm certainly conceding that these are important causes, but I am going to focus today on the influence of political tribalism in the contemporary United States, group identity, and how those forces make it really hard for the American political class to put forward ambitious climate legislation. Now, I think it's fair to say that at least over the last 2 decades, climate change, the climate conversation, I'm not sure conversation is the right word here, but I'm going to go for this. The climate conversation in the United States has morphed into a new front in the so-called culture wars, right? So I'm certain that most of you are familiar with this idea of culture wars, which is so central to discussions about American politics. I mean, probably the most often discussed culture war is the culture war over the rights to have an abortion, but there are also culture wars about affirmative action, gun rights, pronouns, you name it, right? And so climate change now is no exception, and is now an ideological and partisan battlefield in which political activists and a large fraction of the US electorate have identified a conservative or right-wing position and a left-wing or liberal or progressive position. They view this issue as an issue in which you should never compromise with the other side, an issue which is not just about greenhouse gases or energy system, but really about national identity, about what the country should be about. So the stakes are really high and there's almost no room for compromise. Okay, and so I'm going to be talking about this, and I'm going to build on the works of social psychologists who I think have made a really, really important contribution to our understanding of the way public opinion in the US and elsewhere processes information and arguments and discourses about climate change. So if you are interested in digging deeper into this subject, I would strongly recommend that you look at the publications of the Yale program on climate change communication. You will find a lot of very compelling materials there. I would also recommend the works of Dan Kahan and his colleagues also at Yale University and their emphasis on cultural cognition. I'm going to talk about that more in a second. And if you want to have a synthesis of the state of research in social psychology regarding climate communication and how public opinion deals with climate change as an issue, I would strongly recommend How Culture Shapes the Climate Change Debate by Andrew Hoffman. So let me just explain, let me try and summarize the contribution made by those social psychologists. So I think that their contribution stems from their recognition of the limitations of the classical liberal theory of the free marketplace of ideas, right? So this theory to the effect that in a free and open society, you need to have free speech, and that's actually true. You do need to have free speech, and that actually, if you're prepared to accept that speech will not be regulated, bad ideas will confront good ideas, lies will circulate, there will be a lot of tensions, but as time goes on, the better ideas, the more compelling ideas, the more socially useful ideas will end up prevailing, and society will benefit from it. And the climate conversation in the United States goes to show that that this is not usually how it works, and this is not how it has been working with climate change. Now, I just want to make it very clear that I'm not taking a stand against free speech. I think free speech is extremely valuable. We should just make sure that we continue to have it. That's not my point. My point is that, if we follow the logic of the free marketplace of ideas, what should have happened was that, at one point in the 1990s, climate scientists would have gone out and explained to the public what was going on, the reason why human-made climate change was happening, what the stakes were, what the potential consequences were, what could be done about the problem. And then, with the free marketplace of ideas and free exchange of ideas, people would have understood how important this issue was. They would have begun to change their ways and to put pressure on their political officials to pass ambitious climate action. But as you probably know, this is not how things have turned out. And that is because, according to social psychologists, because of the power and influence of what they call cultural cognition, right? So cultural cognition is a social and cultural phenomenon in which, when confronted with new ideas and with new arguments and new policy proposals, an individual or a group of individuals will not just take the piece of information at face value, but actually the piece of information will go through a cultural filter through which, thanks to which the person or the group of individuals will be able to make sense of this piece of information, and they will also be able to position themselves. And in this process, social and cultural identity trumps facts. In other words, what really matters to most individuals when they are confronted with arguments about climate change are the implications with regards to their worldview and with regards to what most members of the social group that they belong to think about this problem. So let me give you a specific example, because I don't think I'm making a lot of sense right now. So just to make it easier to understand. So if you take the fictional example of a white evangelical Christian who leans conservative, is a regular Republican voter, in the state of Oklahoma. And, that person is confronted with an argument, a speech by a climate scientist about the urgencies to act with regard on climate change. They will not just take this at face value. They are likely to actually think about what other members of the social group that he belongs to, how they think about this issue. And so they're likely to either ignore what the climate scientist is going to say. They're going to explain or think that this is an issue for liberals, people who do not have the same values as they do. And in the end, they will either tune out or just reject the proposals made by this climate scientist. I mean, this would also apply to a liberal scholar on the East Coast who knows that her group thinks that this issue is very important. And even if she doesn't know anything about the issue, she is more likely to engage with what she's going to hear from this climate scientist, right? So the point here, the main point, is that your sense of cultural identity matters a lot more than the facts, okay? And this is particularly problematic in the context of the contemporary United States, because as you all know, the U.S. national politics has been for at least the early 1990s in a state of very high polarization. It has become less and less easy to reach compromise. There is more and more partisan and ideological confrontation. And so arguments about climate change, data, news, information about climate change are being circulated in an environment in which Democrats and Republicans are trying to oppose one another at every turn. And so climate change obviously is no exception. And here, I think it's hard to overestimate the importance of what political scientists Alan Abramovitz and Stephen Webster have called negative partisanship, okay? So I'm going to quote part of the extract that you see up on the screen. When negative partisanship happens, quote, supporters of each party perceive supporters of the opposing party as very different from themselves in terms of their social characteristics and fundamental values. As a result, voters tend to hold very negative opinions of the opposing party's leaders, and supporters prefer not to associate with those who support the opposing party and are less likely to consider voting for the candidates from the opposing party. And actually, I think negative partisanship goes a long way toward explaining why in 2016, so many Republican female voters who were uncomfortable with Donald Trump, with his personality, with his conduct, eventually voted for him regardless, because they wanted to beat the other side. They didn't want to quote Donald Trump, that nasty woman, Hillary Clinton, to win. And so in the end, they voted for the Republican candidate, not because they liked him, not because they were attracted to him, but because it was their political tribe, okay? And so this has had this state of hyperpolarization has really shaped the climate conversation in the United States. In other words, once climate change became politicized, and by that I mean that once climate change was identified by many voters, especially people who engage with politics, who care about it, once it was identified as a bone of contention pitting Republicans against Democrats, conservatives against liberals, the climate conversation turned into a pitched battle, a sort of gigantic food fight, pitting the right against the left. So you have, and obviously, as with other culture wars, passions tend to run high. So you have some examples here. On the right of the political spectrum, climate activists are often portrayed as out of touch, un-American, unpatriotic misanthropes who wants to destroy the American dream, free enterprise. There's also a conspiratorial dimension to the way many Republicans and many conservatives think about the issue of climate change. This looms very large in a novel by Michael Crichton of Jurassic Park fame, State of Fear, which was published in 2004. It is a novel about a socialist, an international socialist conspiracy using climate change as a pretext to dismantle the free enterprise movement. And this is captured by this line by a conservative political lobbyist called Steve Malloy: green is the new red, right? This idea that the green movement is really a watermelon, green on the outside, but really red inside, right? And obviously, passions run really high as well. On the other side of the political spectrum, you can see some examples here. I'm not going to go through all of them. And this is obviously having some significant repercussions on how average voters and people in the United States react to questions about climate change, the way they think about this issue. And here I'd like to briefly show you a series of slides produced by Gallup about, and which those slides really shine a spotlight on the yawning gap between Democratic-leaning Americans and Republican-leaning Americans when it comes to climate change, right? So the first question was about the effects of global warming having already begun. In 2021, and this is actually getting worse. In 2021, 82% of Democrats believed that it was the case, when less than a third of Republicans agreed. About 2/3 of Democrats in 2021 said that they thought that climate change was going to pose serious threat in their own lifetime, when it was only 11% when the question was asked to Republican-leaning respondents. And then the last one is also very interesting, because it's a way of gauging, of sort of measuring the influence and importance of climate change skepticism in American society, because it's a question about whether climate change is human-made. And so if you don't think that climate change is human-made, that sort of makes you a climate skeptic almost by definition, okay? Because the point here is that climate change is happening as a result of human activities. Now, about a third of Republicans agree with that statement, when almost 90% of Democrats agree, right? So you see here how polarized the American public appears to be on this issue. Now, before I go back to cultural cognition, and then I wrap up my presentation, I hope I'm not going to be too long. I just wanted very briefly to review the main themes in Republican and right-wing advocacy regarding climate change. So first of all, I want to emphasize that climate skeptic rhetoric in the United States often sounds very populist. It's very populist, sound very populistic. That's what I wanted to say. And it usually pits average citizens, Joe Sixpack, against self-righteous and hypocritical elites. And really, the best example of that is probably the former Vice President, Al Gore, who unsuccessfully ran for president in 2000. And Al Gore has really emerged as the archetype of the out-of-touch climate change phony that American climate skeptics love to hate, right? There are others, right? Leonardo DiCaprio would be another, but I think Al Gore is really, really at the top of the pile. So you see here another example of this populist rhetoric, a cartoon mocking Pete Buttigieg when he was running for the Democratic nomination for president, on a private jet, eating a burger, and considering how he was going to ask average people in the US to make sacrifices. Another, and then one last example, I could hardly resist reading this quote as a French person. So this is taken from the speech that Trump delivered when he announced that the United States would pull out of the Paris Accord. So, quote, "It is time to put Youngstown, Ohio, Detroit, Michigan, and Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, along with many other locations within our great country, before Paris, France." Now, let me turn to another recurring theme, which is the defense of consumerism and the American way of life. And this is one of the most powerful arguments that can be mobilized in the context of American society. And here I'd like to quote from a book that Steve Malloy, the conservative, free market conservative lobbyist I quoted earlier on, a book that he wrote in 2009, Green Hell. So let me quote: "Make no mistake, living green is really about someone else micro-regulating you, downsizing your dreams, and plugging each one of us into a brand new social order for which we never bargained. Man-made global warming is simply their latest, so the Greens' latest and by far most successful organized campaign to achieve this transformation. They plan to diminish the famous geographic, social, and economic mobility of Americans, the American dream, the very things that have always made us feel that anything is possible. They are keen to reverse our noble advancements in producing more goods and services at less cost. They rail against economic growth as a blight on society and the planet, right? Now, a corollary to this argument is the defense of free enterprise and American capitalism. So here I'm coming back to this idea that capitalism, American capitalism, is under attack from socialists disguised as environmentalists. So the watermelon metaphor, green on the outside and red inside. So here's the other quote. That's my last quote, I promise. By making energy scarce, the Greens create larger avenues for expanding the government's power over the individual. It is extremely rare in history that a government responds to a crisis by lessening its own powers, which is actually true, I think. Think about the Great Depression, which ushered in the massive expansion known as the New Deal. An energy crisis would be similar. It would create an opportunity and even a public demand for the government to do whatever it takes to solve the problem. When combined with the supposed crisis of global warming, energy shortages provide the Greens with an urgent rationale for unprecedented government action. Okay, so this is a quote from Steve Malloy. Now, those arguments seem to resonate with many Republican voters, and I should say especially with many Republican primary voters. I don't think that all Republican voters are equal, and that I don't think they all wield the same influence, and we can talk about that during question time. I think, you know, this idea that there are people who are more engaged in politics, and they happen to be those who are most likely to be radical about those issues. So here, and I'm coming close to the end of my presentation, I promise, I want to go back to cultural cognition, just to loop the loop, if you will. I think that cultural cognition is really helpful here because, again, you know, you have to bear in mind that once climate change is politicized, then people's cultural and political identities matter more than the factual evidence, if you will. And that would be right both on the right and the left. And here I'd like to go back to Dan Kahan, the Yale social psychologist I referenced earlier on. He and his colleagues have published fascinating articles and studies about how Americans respond to climate change and news about climate change. And actually they found, well, okay, let me explain what they did. So what they did is that they decided to ask Democratic-leaning respondents and Republican-leaning respondents a series of questions about the basics of climate science. So, questions that you don't have to be a physicist to be able to answer, but you cannot really answer those questions if you haven't educated yourself about these issues. So, questions about what a greenhouse gas is, what the greenhouse effect is, and that make it possible for you to signal that you know about this issue or that you don't know about this issue. And what they found was that both Republican-leaning respondents and Democratic-leaning respondents scored very low, right? So, I mean, there were people who were knowledgeable about this problem, but mostly Republicans and Democrats did not outperform Republicans, right? Which meant that, and here I'm going to quote from Kahan, that people's answers to whether one believes in human-caused global warming didn't measure what they knew, it expressed who they were. It was about their identity, right? Because, otherwise Democrats would have scored higher, right? They would have demonstrated that the reason why they cared more about this issue was because they had educated themselves about it, and they had come to understand that it really mattered. But that's not what happened, right? Instead, many Democrats have understood from elite cues, for example, that this issue mattered to the left, that it was an issue on which Republicans tended to be irresponsible, and then they have taken positions that aligned with their political tribe, right? An even more disturbing finding was that they found that the more educated and scientifically literate Republican respondents were, the more likely they were to respond in a partisan way. And that's apparently because they're intellectually better equipped to find ways of circumventing contradictions, overcoming objections to their positions, right? And so I think that cultural cognition goes a long way towards explaining why it is very hard for Republican elected officials to break ranks from right-wing and Republican orthodoxy on climate change, as on many other politically contentious issues, right? So, in other words, in most instances, there is no political price to be paid for climate skepticism. But even worse, right, for many Republicans, Republican officials, they fear that there might be a price for getting behind the Inflation Reduction Act, for instance, which I mentioned earlier on, right? And now I'm coming to my last slide. I was lying before, but this is really the last one. This is my conclusion, I promise. And so I want to ask, what the future holds, right? What is to be expected from the perspective of Republicans? And I would say short answer is probably more of the same, okay? I keep track of how the think tanks that I referenced at the beginning react to the energy crisis right now or to the Inflation Reduction Act. I look at what Republican candidates are saying in the current election cycle, and I found that, what I hear sounds very similar to what I heard before. However, one may wonder, and this is just a hypothesis, right? One may wonder whether a significant number of Republican officials might evolve as time goes by and as the green tech sector becomes more and more economically prominent in many regions of the United States, including in heavily Republican states, right? So you probably know that the wind industry and the solar industry have been growing by leaps and bounds in the US for about 13, 14 years. You have to go back to Obama's first term. And therefore, there are places in the US where Republican officials tend now to favor the wind industry. So the wind industry is relatively prominent in the state of Texas, which is governed by Republicans. Now, I think they send mixed messages about the wind industry there. But, that's an interesting development. And I was also struck at the end of Donald Trump's term in office by the way the two Republican senators from the state of Iowa reacted to a speech that Trump delivered, I think it was in the last year of his presidency, or maybe 2 years before the end of his presidency, a speech in which he argued that wind turbines caused cancer. So I don't really know where he found that, but he said that. And interestingly, the two Republican senators from the state of Iowa publicly pushed back against this dumb statement. And, you know, I'm sure that one of the reasons why Chuck Grassley, you can see on the screen, is running for re-election at 89 years of age this cycle. You know, one of the reasons why he pushed back was because it was a dumb statement, but I'm pretty sure that the other reason probably is because the wind industry has become pretty big in the state of Iowa. So he said, you know, no, you know, wind turbines do not cause cancer. That's a stupid thing to say. And, you know, we're behind wind energy in the United States. So I don't know what's going to happen. I mean, these are mostly exceptions, to be honest, but I'm curious to see how things evolve over time as the effects of the Inflation Reduction Act begin to make themselves felt. I'm going to stop here. Thank you so much for your attention, and I'm happy to take your questions if you have any. And I hope I wasn't too long.
Thank you, Jean-Daniel. Can people hear me? This is Gareth here. Yeah, I'm very sorry I couldn't join you at the beginning due to a technological meltdown. Thanks very much, Jean-Daniel, Enrique, and Oscar for having got the ball rolling without me. Anyway, any questions? Matthew.
Hi, thank you very much for the very interesting talk. I have a few points or questions. I'll try and be brief. On the last slide, you mentioned potential futures for Republican action going forward. My research focuses on modern Republicans from the 1980s to the present day. So you mentioned also at the beginning some organizations like the Climate Solutions Caucus. How do you think how do you account for some of the other organizations that are sort of coming about, such as the Conservative Climate Caucus chaired by John Curtis of Utah, which has 73 members now in the House of Representatives. You know, you had the COP26 Republican delegation, the first Republican delegation to a COP summit. So how do we account for some of these sorts of issues? On the discussion of sort of polarization and cultural cognition, I think it's a very interesting approach. But could this not be, as we're talking about Republican voters not being of equal value, merely an issue of issue salience? You know, you've got about a third of Republicans who are pro-choice, but you don't have anywhere near that in terms of elected representatives. On some of the policy issues you were mentioning on carbon taxation, you have over 50% of Republican voters who are polled by Pew who support such action, but obviously don't vote accordingly. So is this an issue salience matter? And finally, to be a bit of a sort of cheeky contrarian when it comes to partisanship, do you include some Democrats in your conservative coalition against climate action? You know, you mentioned cap and trade. That passed by 6 votes in the House and 8 Republicans voted for it and 44 Democrats voted against. And that was a time when the Senate had a Democratic supermajority. So is this solely a Republican issue, or is this a wider issue in American sort of conservative consensus, which splits both parties? Anyway, thank you. That's a few points.
All right, thank you so much. So I'm going to start with your question about the Conservative Climate Caucus. I mean, you didn't just focus on the Conservative Climate Caucus. So, you know, just to explain to those of you who've never heard about it, so it was formed in June 2021. And it is making a Republican case for climate action. So they emphasize natural gas to replace coal, nuclear as well, and carbon capture and sequestration. Their objectives are much lower than that of the Democrats, but you're right. I mean, it would be wrong to say that nothing's happening, and this was not the focus of my talk, but you know, you have to account for those people. Now, okay, so these are just, I'm not sure about what I'm going to say. I just have, you know, I have a theory about why they're doing what they're doing. I think that one of the reasons why you hear those people is because they want to signal to maybe independents, for example, that the Republican Party is not a party that doesn't take this seriously at all. So they come up with their own proposals that are less ambitious. You know, this is also happening in corporate America. More and more institutions and companies are now pushing for a carbon tax. Interestingly, at the moment when Democrats no longer seem to be interested in a carbon tax. So I think maybe to a degree, some take this seriously, but I think it's a way for them to position themselves as not completely out of the pale when it comes to climate change. But you know, if you look at the so I wrote it down because I didn't want to use the wrong the wrong name. So okay, so let me just, so you know that the Republicans published a document in the context of the midterms in order to explain what they would do if they're able to seize Congress. So I can't remember what the name of this document is. You probably remember it. Okay, let me find it. Commitment to America, right? So Commitment to America. There's no mention of climate change in Commitment to America. And right now, energy issues are really prominent in this election cycle for understandable reasons. And if you keep track of what Republicans are saying is that, you know, they say that you should increase the production of fossil fuels in the United States. So that gives you an idea of how marginal those efforts are. And I don't think the Conservative Climate Caucus attracts a lot of attention from people outside Washington and even in Washington. So you're right, they do exist. They make proposals, but maybe they're just going through the motions. With regards to issue salience, did you mean that it was maybe because this issue didn't matter very much to Republicans? I mean,
yes, so in polls, particularly with younger Republican voters and on certain policy issues, you are seeing an increase in people who are at least supportive of greater climate action among Republican and lead voters. But that's not transferring into how they vote. So is this merely a sort of, yes, we acknowledge it's an important issue, but it's not one that affects how we vote at the end of the day?
Yeah, I think that would be one of the reasons. The other reason I think has to do with, you know, what I said at one point in my talk when I said that not all Republicans are equal, that, you know, not all Republican voters are equal. And here, you know, I'd like to go back to Alan Abramovitz and what he says about the engaged segment of the public. I think that's the expression that he uses. The politically engaged segment of the public. I wrote this down, right? So they are the people who care most about politics. They are the people who are likely to vote in primary elections. And those people are more partisan than the rest of the population. They are more influential because they show up, right? And so a lot of American voters don't show up. I'm sure you're familiar, maybe you're familiar with the work of the political scientist Jason Brennan against democracy, when he talks about, you know, the fact that most voters in liberal democracies, including in the US, he focuses on the US, are hobbits, right? So they are people who don't really care about politics. They get on with their lives. They don't pay a lot of attention to what's going on. A lot of them do not vote or, you know, don't take politics very seriously. And then they're about 70% of the electorate, or, you know, of the citizenry, if you will. And then you have about 28% of the population who are hooligans. So the hooligans are high information voters. They participate in primary elections. They make campaign contributions. They will influence the Republican candidate for the Senate in Oklahoma, because that's the only, you know, the primary, Republican primary is the only election that matters. And those people are really more radical than average, much more radical than average. And they are the ones who create an environment in which you know, it is risky, politically risky for a Republican candidate to try and meet the Democrats halfway on climate. So I think that, you know, I want to be very careful, because I think that the main story here is partisanship, right, that I talked about. But I don't want to create the impression that this applies to everyone in the United States. I think most normal people don't care about politics very much. They don't get riled up when you use the expression climate change. But the problem here is that those people who do get riled up when you mention the words climate and the word change are people who will actually shape the behavior, the political behavior of many Republican officials, right? And so but you're also right that, you know, when you ask people whether they want a carbon tax, they will answer your question, but it doesn't mean that they care about it, right? I mean, if you ask me a question about euthanasia, I'm going to answer, but I mean, this is not an issue that is at the top of my mind. It doesn't, it has no impact on who I'm going to vote for in the next French presidential election. So, you're right about that. And then your last question was about those Democrats who were not exactly helpful on the issue of climate change. I think there are fewer and fewer of those. So you're right. I mean, for example, we can go back to the Kyoto Protocol when the President Clinton actually signed the Kyoto Protocol in 1998, but he didn't even send it to the Senate for ratification, because before he had time to do it, 98 Democratic and Republican senators had issued a statement, a Senate resolution to the effect that as long as China and other emerging markets were not required to cut their emissions, the American Senate would not even consider discussing the treaty, because it was a binding agreement, so it was like a treaty in the United States. But I think those days are long gone. So, if you've paid attention, I mean, you obviously know about this, obviously, but I mean, if the audience has paid attention to, the tortuous path to the Inflation Reduction Act, you've heard about Joe Manchin, but Joe Manchin is really an exception, right? I mean, right now, I mean, you could say that Kirsten Sinema is an exception also, but I mean, Joe Manchin is really an exception. Most Democratic officials in Congress were prepared to pass this very ambitious piece of climate legislation, and it was, it just so happens that they only had 50 votes, so it was the president of the United States for all intents and purposes. I'm overstating the case, but I think there are fewer and fewer of those people. They are, sorting out. So I'm sure that some of them are nervous about some of the policies of the Biden administration regarding energy, but the Biden administration is also very nervous, right? I mean, they talk a big game. They have achieved a lot, right? I mean, you have to be fair about this. It would be unfair to say that they have achieved nothing. I mean, the Inflation Reduction Act is a big deal. The infrastructure bill that was passed the year before was also a big deal. But they also, I mean, one of their priorities is to convince the oil industry to extract more oil from the public domain, even as they ran on a platform that pushed for less fossil fuel production in the United States. Joe Biden went to Saudi Arabia to beg Mohammed bin Salman to produce more oil. So they're all nervous about this, right? I mean, there are a lot of carrots in what they're doing. There are incentives, but there are not a lot of sticks, right? So, but I'm sort of digressing here. So I don't know if I answered all of your questions, or maybe I'm happy to hear if you disagree with some of what I've been saying. I mean, I'm not the host, so maybe I should do that.
Thank you very much, Jean-Daniel. I am the host, although not a very effective one. Cosimo.
Hi there. Yeah, I just wanted to ask. I feel very effective in identifying sort of the problem, if you like, in that people are voting in this sort of very partisan way, not in accordance with like the facts, but like culturally. I was going to ask, do we have any sort of research or knowledge as to how to change that? So how to actually get to these Republican voters and convince them that, this shouldn't be treated as a partisan issue, that, this is more a human issue? Or are we just kind of stuck? Is there any way for climate scientists to actually approach these voters without coming off as condescending or hypocritical and so on?
So that's a good question. I think a lot of a lot of social psychologists have grappled with the question you asked. And I think if you go to the book that I referenced by Andrew Hoffman, you will find some, he's not the only one who's made proposals, but he's tried to explain how you could try and sway conservative-leaning Americans on the issue of climate change. So there are recommendations about the messenger, right? So the idea that the messenger is every bit as important as the message itself. So, you know, he, for example, he just argues that Al Gore is not the right messenger because, you know, he's a polarizing figure. So he cites some examples of public figures who could actually help Republicans in the United States, conservatives in the United States engage on this issue. So one example that he gives is the Pope. Okay, so you know that about 25% of Americans are Catholics. So that's one of his recommendations. I think another recommendation that is often made is, you know, you should address those issues without uttering the words climate change. So, you know, there are different ways of skinning a cat, I'm told. I hope that this expression can be used here. And so, you know, you can emphasize national security. You can just focus on energy issues, on public health, depending on who you're addressing. So in many ways, you can try and adapt to the people you address. I don't know if you've ever heard about actually an evangelical climate scientist called Katharine Hayhoe. She's a climate scientist. She's also an evangelical Christian. She's realized that in her community, not a lot of people take the issue of climate change seriously. So she's tried to you know, move the ball forward on this. And, you know, I remember hearing her talk about a talk that she gave about issue related to climate change. She didn't actually use the words climate change. And one lady at one point came to her and thanked her for a talk and said it was fascinating. And then, you know, she, you know, as the conversation went along, she just said, well, you know, that's much more interesting than all of this bullshit about climate change, right? So, or global warming. So so, you know, Katharine Hayhoe had managed to convey some important messages about climate change without using those words. I'm not sure it's a, you know, viable path forward, but these are some ways in which this can be tried. But, you know, I'm not very optimistic about this personally, especially given how polarized American politics is. So, you know, I mean, you have to try, right? Obviously, but I'm sure there are other recommendations that can be made, but you know, at the top of my head, these are the two I would come up with. I don't know if that answers your question. But
on the screen, I see a hand, and next to it, I see G. Leslie. I don't know who I don't know what your first name is, but the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Given the unending cycle, especially over the last 18 months of floods, fires, hurricanes, drought, record temperatures, so the personal experience of more and more Republicans facing what they must realize is not exactly the patterns of climate that they previously experienced. Won't they themselves, these individual Republicans, wonder if not probably change their minds about the reality of climate change and perhaps express to organizations they're members of, if they are, or that certain organizations, maybe not many to start with, will themselves see the reality? And do you not think that there will be some movement inevitably over time because of it being so clear, so evident, so that they will, maybe organizations will have to slightly change their positions in order to face realities of the situation as it is?
all right, so you're asking me to predict the future, and I'm really good at this. You know, I predicted that Hillary Clinton was going to crush Donald Trump in the 2016 election. I told all of my students I'm really good at predicting the future. I'm going to try, though, you know.
But hasn't that actually already happened? There's been, has there not been expressions of, you know, and there needs to be maybe not more polling because these things have been happening relatively recently, but incredible amounts of, there surely things are moving.
So okay, so I'm going to try and answer. It's a very important question. It's a very interesting question. It's not easy to answer. So my sense, okay, so I don't think it has happened on the scale necessary to move the needle on the American right at all. Okay, I think maybe what the sequence of events that you're describing may happen in the future if things get worse and worse. I don't think it's happening right now in the United States because of, I think, mainly because of the influence of partisanship. And, you know, we can take the example of a purple state, the state of Florida, which is particularly exposed to climate risks. And, you know, they suffered, you know, last summer, there was this hurricane. I mean, that wasn't even last summer. I mean, it was last month, I think, right? I mean, devastating consequences there. So, you know, I mean, it's not the only place in the US, but if there's one place where you can try and get a sense of what climate change may do to the United States, Florida is one of the places you should go to, right? And, you know, I don't see what you're saying. I'm not seeing it happening, you know, that, you know, the Republican Party is actually pretty strong in Florida. I don't think there's any indication that what just happened in Florida, which climate scientists linked to climate change publicly, I don't think it's affecting the chances of Republican candidates there, even though it just happened. And also, I think that, you know, as you said, you know, there has been a terrible cycle of devastating events over the last 18 months, and yet climate change is not, I think, an important issue in the midterm, right? So if it mattered to Republicans in Florida, it would be front and center. I don't think it is, right? I mean, for example, I mean, I pay a lot of attention to the Inflation Reduction Act. It's a big deal, right? Whether you think it's the right way of approaching decarbonization, it's definitely a big deal. And it doesn't seem to be a big factor in this campaign, right? So you would think that if those weather events were changing minds in Republican circles, maybe you know, Democrats would emphasize their passage of the largest piece of climate legislation in human history, and they don't seem to be doing this, especially in competitive races, right? What I see instead are Democratic candidates who are saying that they support fracking. I mean, not all of them, but the, you know, people who say that you should actually increase fossil fuel production. So short answer to your question is, I don't see the trend that you're describing happening. I think that the main reason is partisanship. Also because historically climate change is not an issue that is at the top of the political agenda in the United States. If you look at the list of public policy priorities in the US compiled by the Pew Research Center, it usually ranks very low. So that's another factor. But however, the jury's still out, right? Because climate change is ongoing, it's going to get worse, so there will be more devastating events. So maybe at one point, it will have an impact. But I don't know if I have time to, just because I'm just thinking out loud here, but to go back to Florida, there was a Republican member of the House of Representatives called Carlos Curbelo, who represented a district in the southern tip of Florida, and he was not shy about emphasizing the issue of climate change, the need for Republicans to make real proposals and a real effort to engage on this issue. And, you know, Carlos Curbelo was beaten by a Democratic candidate, I think, in 2020 or 2018, I believe. And he just disappeared from, I mean, he didn't disappear from the political scene, but he did not survive politically for very long. Now, that wasn't because he advocated for climate action, but, you know, he was one of those Republicans who were willing to engage, and he lost very quickly his office. There are also examples of Republicans who tried to engage on climate and eventually lost the Republican nomination in the primary election. So this is not happening right now, but it might happen in the future. Your guess is as good as mine.
Yes. So there might be, so I was thinking more in terms of this being stage one, that individual Republican voters, having experienced such events, will themselves have their mindsets change, and then perhaps more recent polling would find a shift. But that obviously would take a long time to translate into Republican politicians changing what they say, for fear that they will not be representing sufficient numbers of Republicans, that it'd be too risky to actually move their political position. Because that's more or less where we are.
If I can just jump in there, maybe I can just leave that as a comment rather than a further question, if you don't mind. And
thank you.
Thank you. And ask Adam, do you have a question?
Yes, I do. It leads on from the previous question. And I was going to ask more or less the same question, but I was in formulating a sort of follow-on question. Do you believe that basically the way forward will be through US scientists in universities and research establishments that will lead the way in convincing everyone? And I'm thinking in terms of what happened at COVID, that the scientists started to become prominent in terms of how they were able to get across the message on COVID, and whether it is now up to the sort of universities and perhaps the scientific establishments, that can be as in government and independent, who can try to get that message across, the importance of climate change, and whether they've been successful so far, or whether it's simply because they've been, held back for perhaps their funding of their departments, that they're reluctant to get into this argument. What are your views about that?
Well, I mean, I think my entire talk is about saying that it makes no difference if those people come forward when it comes to Republicans and the American right? Because I think that for,
well, yeah, if you take the COVID example.
Yes.
That I got the impression, maybe, that actually the scientists were winning the argument there in the end. I mean, admittedly, Trump sort of put, but actually it was because Trump didn't listen to the scientists. One could argue he lost the election. Okay, so he'd been more proactive.
So my impression is that on COVID, they also failed. I mean, this is still a very polarizing issue. I mean, one of the reasons, for example, why the current governor of Florida is one of the odds-on favorites to win the. I'm not saying he's going to get the Republican nomination in 2022, Governor DeSantis. But one of the reasons why he's become so popular with Republican activists, with conservative hooligans, if you will, to paraphrase Jason Brennan, is because he opposed COVID restrictions in his state of Florida. This put him in the limelight in a very positive way in Republican circles. It seems that Republicans and Democrats are really polarized on the issue of COVID. I remember reading a survey by the New York Times, or done for the New York Times, about how people in the United States thought about their personal risk regarding COVID. And they found that conservatives over the age of 60 thought that their risk was very low on average, and liberals who were 25 or below the age of 25 tended to overestimate their personal risk. So that doesn't strike me as an issue in which scientists carried the day and eventually convinced both Republicans and Democrats. Again, because partisanship is a hell of a drug, right? I mean, it doesn't explain everything, right? But it explains a lot, and explains a lot when it comes to public reactions to COVID and public reactions to climate change. And I think that the current energy crisis, that's a guess on my part, but I'm going to try, is going to make it worse, right? Because decarbonization is very hard, right? And so climate change is a terrible problem. It's very hard to deal with. It will lead to disastrous consequences. We've heard about that. But it's also very, very hard to bring about decarbonization, especially when you have an energy crisis, which is probably, I mean, it's worse here in Europe than it is in the United States, but it's also pretty bad in the United States. It's likely to last for several years. And so I mean, climate activists will have to continue to move the ball forward, especially using regulations in the US in the years to come, in a context in which it will be very easy to say that climate action makes energy more expensive, even if that's not true, right? I mean, that's not the point. I mean, it's not just about truth, remember, right? So I'm very skeptical. I mean, you mentioned in your question academics and professors and scientists. I mean, these are identified usually by Republican and conservative activists as people who are overwhelmingly liberal, and most of them are liberal. That's also true. That's factually correct. So they don't belong to the same political tribe. They think they have a liberal agenda. And so, you know, I mean, I'm not optimistic about this for sure.
So you don't think that the lessons from COVID, because everything you said, I don't disagree.
Sorry to interrupt you, Adam, but we're coming towards the end and got other questions.
Sorry. All right.
Yeah, so Enrique.
Yes, thank you, Gareth, and thank you, Jean-Daniel, for such an interesting presentation. I was just wondering if you could expand a little on the reasons why climate skepticism became sort of the preferred response of the American right to this issue, as opposed to market-based approaches. Because let us not forget, you know, cap and trade, those sort of things were largely designed by Wall Street financiers. So it's not like a radical agenda at all. You mentioned at some point that John McCain actually tried to push this agenda forward. So if you could expand, why do you think he sort of failed to win the argument for sort of market-based solutions that, as I said, could easily be part of a conservative agenda?
It's a very good question. And you know that I also mentioned Obama's and the Democrats' effort in 2009 to pass a cap and trade bill. And the reason why they had come up with cap and trade bill was because they wanted to come up with a solution that could be seen and sold as a market solution, okay? And it failed completely. I mean, you know, and that's why this time around they just forgot about this. They did the Democrats only focused on themselves. They didn't try to convince Republicans. They knew it was a lost cause. I think they were right in the end. I was surprised that they were able to pass this bill, but they did. So impressive. Okay, so again, I'm going to have to try and guess. So I think there are several reasons. First of all, maybe because it's not about the free market, but it's about the interests of some very powerful corporations who are looking after their profit margins. So, you know, this was not the focus of my talk. I thought that it was more interesting to talk about an issue that is less often discussed, although, you know, political partisanship is also very often discussed. So that would be one reason, is that you know, imposing a carbon tax that could have been increased over time, they tried in the early 1990s, would have been detrimental to the profit margins of oil corporations in the United States. And because they wield a lot of influence, not just in Republican circles, of course, also to a degree in Democratic circles, but here we're focused on the right. They invested in lobbying, they invested in campaigns, and to a degree, they got what they wanted. So that would be one very cynical explanation. And the other one is, I'm coming back to the main focus of my talk, is partisanship, right? So in the end, it's not about, so with negative partisanship, for example, ideology doesn't matter nearly as much as partisanship, right? So of course, the defense of the free market as a principle, going back to Reagan, is really consubstantial to the identity of the American right. So most of the activists campaigning against cap and trade or a carbon tax would say that they do it on behalf of the free market because they don't want to have a socialist solution to a non-problem. But if you remember that it's about winning, it's about beating the other side, it's about making sure that the Democrats don't get to win. I think it's very, I don't know if there are any football fans here. I'm a big football fan. I'm not going to tell you that I'm a Paris Saint-Germain fan because everyone's going to leave if I say that. I've been a Paris Saint-Germain fan for a long time. And if I always tell my students that if you are, and almost none of my students are football fans, but I always tell them, if you're a hardcore football fan, you will understand. I was so happy last night when Tottenham beat Marseille, right? That's very sad. That's kind of pathetic, but that's really how I felt. And in many ways, that's not a joke. That's what's going on here, right? So it's not about the free market. It's not about those principles. It is for some, right? I mentioned the Niskanen Center, R Street. There are people who take this seriously. But in the end, if it's just an approach to politics that is really a zero-sum game in which your tribe has to beat the other tribe, then it doesn't matter whether cap and trade is actually a market solution to climate change. What matters is that you prevented Obama from getting a win after he beat your candidate in 2008. And that's very sad. It's in many ways very down to earth, but I think it explains a lot of what is going on here, right? But I remember, my answers are too long, but I'm just going to add that the father, if you will, of the carbon tax, who got the Nobel Prize for economics, what was his name again? American economist of the 1980s. Anyway, he wrote a book titled The Climate Casino. And in the book, he says, well, I don't understand why I'm getting attacked by conservatives who describe themselves as free market advocates, because my solution is a free market solution. A carbon tax is a mechanism through which you're going to use market forces to internalize the negative externalities of growth. That's a market solution. So he said, I'm okay with the free market. I'm a free market economist, and I don't understand why you are coming after me for this. That was too long. Sorry.
That's fine.
And I talked about football, which was bad.
If there's no Olympic Marseille fans who are demanding a right of reply, no, then maybe I can ask the last question, Jean-Daniel, if that's okay. I was thinking about the Anthony Giddens book on the international politics of climate change, and he makes the obvious point that although the politics of climate change are very febrile in the US, that actually politics of climate change are intrinsically difficult because they run up against the short-termism of politics, and they often involve a language of sacrifice that is very uncongenial for politicians in any political system. But I was just wondering, and it may be that Enrique or Maxine or Paolo would have views on this as well, but I was wondering, Jean-Daniel, if you think that the politics of climate change are particularly difficult in societies that started out as settler societies. I'm thinking, for example, that they are in Canada, they are in Australia. And I wonder if you have societies that start out being based very much on the extraction of natural resources, but also on just a dream of abundance. If there's a kind of deep historical legacy here that applies to the US, but potentially also to other settler societies, and that applies somewhat less to countries like France and Britain, where political arguments have always been much more about how to divide up finite resources. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Okay, so I've heard this thesis before. It sounds compelling to me, but I have to say I have nothing to add to what you said. So it sounds compelling. I think it's maybe one of the explanations. But if you think that Enrique, for example, may have something to contribute, I'm happy to let him speak, because I've heard that before. It sounds compelling. But I don't think I have anything of value to add to your very good characterization of this thesis. So
what do you think, Enrique, or Paolo, or Maxine, or anyone else for that matter, before we close?
Well, I also think it's a good point. I've heard it before, and the long sort of history behind how things are discussed it's always important. In the context of the US, what I would add, and perhaps Jean-Daniel, you can comment on that, is how we can link this with the ideal of the American dream, right? Because the American dream also has this notion, this aspiration of constant expansion, of getting farther and farther away, that might be linked to the similar rationale of, you know, a settler society that has those sort of very high aspirations. So I don't know if it's linked to that, but I can see that Maxine has something to say. So yeah, of course, Maxine.
Thank you. Very interesting question, Gareth, and just want to take this opportunity to thank Jean-Daniel for a brilliant talk, much of which I agree with, about the kind of problems of partisanship and all of these issues rolled in. I was thinking of Argentina, which is a kind of case of settler, immigrant settled country with sort of, you know, this whole idea of boundless resources and very much kind of agro-based economy, export agro-based economy. And you'd have to do quite a lot of comparative research, wouldn't you, to look at Australia and Canada, which are classically, particularly Australia is compared very often with Argentina in terms of development up to the 1930s at least. But I think that probably politics intervenes in the modern period much more than landscape and natural resources, but it must be a factor. It's the question of how important a factor it is in the overall explanation, but it's an interesting question to look at those countries that have a different kind of resource base, a higher population density, different forms of settlement, just to do those comparisons. It'd be an interesting exercise, so thanks for that.
Great, thank you.
Can I just add to that?
Please.
I mean, I'm very skeptical of the applicability of settler capitalism to Latin America to start with. But I think if you take the case of Brazil, the idea of partisanship seems more powerful as a heuristic device for explaining what's going on. I mean, you know, Bolsonaro plays up the rejection of or climate skepticism and makes this argument that, you know, Brazil needs to develop its resources because that's what Brazil needs in order to grow. Whereas the left, the PT, Lula, take the climate kind of climate responsibility line, which says, you know, the development of Brazil is contingent on the survival of the planet. So I think that the partisanship issue explains a lot better than any sort of deep-rooted explanation based on patterns of colonial or settler society in Brazil, as it doesn't probably in the US.
You're an Arsenal fan, aren't you, Paolo?
Yeah, I was actually very disappointed by Spurs making a comeback the other night. and Marseille has several Arsenal players or former Arsenal players, so I was hoping that they would do the job. But
Maxine, do you want to come back on that?
About football, absolutely not. I will leave that to you.
Okay. Now, I'm a cricket man. So thank you very much, Jean-Daniel. Unless you have anything to say about cricket, Jean-Daniel, we'll
No, I think as a French person, I'm going to be quiet. I have a very good, I lived in England for 2 years, and I have a very good friend who loves cricket. He's actually coming to visit this weekend. And he actually dragged me to a game one day when I was a student at Birmingham University. And I thought it was interesting, but it was a very long day. So
yeah.
I mean, it looks really quaint and very attractive from a French perspective.
Yeah.
But when you actually attend the event, it's kind of long, and but probably because I don't understand the rules of this game. But
or maybe you didn't drink enough beer. Yeah. All right. Thank you, everyone, but especially Jean-Daniel. And what I caught of it, I thought was a fascinating talk, and an important one. Gave us all a lot to think about, and we're very much looking forward to your future publications, and I hope we can find other opportunities to work with you as well.
It's great. I was really flattered and a bit intimidated to be asked to join a UCL event. So, I hope it went okay, and thank you so much for asking me to talk today.
It was great. Thank you very much, and goodbye to you, and goodbye everyone else.
Thank you. Have a good evening, everyone.
Good night.